In black and white, the world of the early 1940s looks restrained yet unsettled. Wide coastal views give way to mid-shots of train platforms crowded with soldiers in plain uniforms waiting with quiet discipline. Close-ups of folded memoranda suggest decisions being shaped in silence, while candid portraits of young recruits capture both resolve and uncertainty. The planning for D-Day has long been presented as a triumph of order, secrecy, and coordination, but archival traces invite a slower reading. Sealed files carry stamped dates that do not always align. Changed reference numbers hint at revisions not fully explained. These details do not erase the larger story, yet they introduce texture and ambiguity. This exploration does not aim to rewrite events, but to examine the subtle tensions between public accounts and private records. What appears smooth in headlines often hides uneven ground in the paperwork. What seems decisive in public speeches sometimes looks cautious in handwritten notes. By following these contrasts, we can approach the human and policy consequences with sharper eyes. The story is less about secret devices or hidden tactics, and more about how ordinary people experienced extraordinary demands, how institutions shaped memory, and how communities absorbed costs. Each chapter opens a window into this layered landscape, moving from coastal fields to closed meeting rooms, from coded transmissions to newspaper headlines, and finally to the daily lives shaped by strategic choices. The black and white frame is both literal and symbolic, carrying us into a world defined by clarity and shadow. Chapter 1: Shadows over coastal preparation. The southern coast of England in the early 1940s appears calm when viewed through monochrome stills. Wide shots reveal hedgerows and low stone walls, while formal uniforms gather in neat formations. Across misted fields, train platforms are crowded with figures in plain coats, standing quietly with packs at their feet. The official story framed these movements as part of an orderly buildup for a decisive strike across the Channel. Yet the rhythm of the photographs suggests more than simple preparation. Soldiers are seen waiting for hours, their expressions caught between determination and fatigue. The momentum appears real but uneven, as if the machinery of war strained under its own weight. Some training schedules carry stamped dates that do not align with later rosters, and such small inconsistencies suggest adjustments or delays not captured in the official account. These details may seem minor, but they indicate that the apparent smoothness of the buildup was more fragile than later narratives suggest. Coastal towns themselves bore the imprint of this moment. Civilians in ordinary coats walked past convoys, their daily routines reshaped by the presence of so many strangers. Lodging houses filled, narrow streets became crowded, and local markets strained to meet demand. Photographs of these ordinary scenes, when placed beside official communiques, highlight a tension between calm appearances and underlying disruption. Black and white stills of folded memoranda on wooden desks hint at calculations behind the visible buildup, decisions that balanced urgency with uncertainty. The mood is not triumphant but steady, deliberate, and somewhat anxious. In every frame, uniforms and civilian coats intermingle, showing how preparation reached into both military and domestic life. Archival evidence suggests the buildup may have served multiple purposes. It appeared aimed at readiness, but it might also have been used to project confidence outward, concealing doubts within. For recruits, the days were filled with routine. Drills, standing in line, and waiting for orders that shifted without explanation. The human scale is striking. Young men looking directly at the camera, aware of their role but unsure of timing. For the communities hosting them, the buildup was at once a reassurance and a disruption, promising protection while straining local resources. Coastal landscapes became layered with meaning, their beaches and roads turned into symbols of what was to come. Yet in the contrast between official optimism and lingering traces of hesitation, we see the first shadow of complexity. This opening phase suggests that preparation was not only about logistics, but also about managing perception, balancing readiness with appearances. The quiet strength of these monochrome images sets the stage for examining what happened inside, the closed rooms where decisions were weighed. The focus now shifts from the visible coastline to the interiors, where folded memoranda and shaded lamps reveal another layer of planning, one that was less about public display and more about negotiation and control. Chapter 2. Inside Rooms. Of Measured Silence. Long nights. Inside windowless rooms carried a different kind of rhythm than the coast. Men in plain uniforms and civilians in dark coats sat at long wooden tables. A folded memorandum lay in front, of many hands. File stamps marked margins in dense blocks of type. Lamps threw small circles of light across maps and paper. The official record presented these gatherings as focused tactical planning. The documents themselves, however, often suggest negotiation as much as pure strategy. Handwritten notes appear. In the margins, sometimes contradicting typed agendas. Changed reference numbers show revisions that arrived late in a sequence. These indicators do not prove an alternate intent. They do, however, complicate a simple reading of careful consensus. Conversations recorded in minutes tend to use careful language. Speakers emphasized coordination, timing, and roles, and they repeated known priorities. Yet the tone in candid photographs seems more cautious. Faces are set in concentration rather than assured triumph. Men adjust uniform lapels under the dull light. Women in plain coats move between filing cabinets and typewriters. The rooms are full of procedural ritual. Teacups sit beside stacks of correspondence. Postal bundles and folded memoranda move from hand to hand. Each exchange carries small performances of authority. Papers are passed, stamped, and filed. The file stamp becomes a recurring emblem in these interiors. It stands for order, but it also covers over revisions. On some sheets, marginal annotations question prior assertions. A single note might hedge a claim or suggest an alternate timeline. These notes often use deferential language and cautious verbs. They may request clarification, or they might recommend further review. The presence of those annotations indicates that decisions were not purely final the moment they were typed. In several folders, reference numbers were altered by hand. The change could signal administrative housekeeping. It could also indicate substantive updates made after initial circulation. Either way, the change leaves evidence of a working process rather than a polished decree. The documentary traces here are tactile and human. A clerk bends over a list. A hand reaches for a stamped envelope. A pair of spectacles rests on a margin where someone has written an initialed comment. Such moments suggest that the work of planning rested on many small acts. Each act could redirect emphasis or postpone. Action. Men who chaired meetings sometimes deferred to quieter voices in the room. Those quieter voices might represent different national interests. They might also reflect military branches with distinct priorities. The balance between urgency and caution is visible in the notebooks. Sometimes a stamped date indicates a decision. Sometimes the same subject carries a later note suggesting reconsideration. Those shifts may reflect new intelligence, or they may show political negotiation. The documents alone rarely resolve which explanation is dominant. Visual records and official communiques, when compared, create attention. Public statements present compressed certainty. They announce readiness and coordinated intent. Inside the rooms, planners often spoke of contingencies. They discussed backup plans and staged phases. The language is careful and deliberately non-committal. That caution likely influenced how orders were drafted and distributed. It may also have affected how subordinate units interpreted their tasks. Within corridors, messengers moved quickly with sealed packets. Train platform scenes outside these buildings mirror the internal movement. Men step off platforms, carry orders, and fold memoranda into pouches. The repetition of these motions turns logistics into choreography. The choreography, however, is imperfect. A delayed message can create confusion in units expecting precise timing. A corrected reference number may force clerks to reissue documents under pressure. These small failures are not dramatic in themselves. They are, however, the kind of friction that makes coordinated action more difficult. Planners understood that absolute control was impossible. They designed systems tolerant of some error, yet tolerance and opacity are distinct. A tolerance for error assumes transparency about that error. Opacity hides its scope. In many rooms, opacity seems to have grown with complexity. The more layers of authorization a paper passed through, the less traceable its origin appeared. When questions were raised, responses sometimes returned as further memos rather than clarifying conversation. Those memos often carried additional file stamps and new reference numbers. This pattern might indicate rigorous review. It might also suggest an effort to bury uncertainty beneath administrative form. The difference matters for how decisions are remembered. When historians read a tidy report with a clear date, they may accept its authority. When they find marginal annotations or corrected numbers, doubt creeps in. Doubt does not negate achievement. It does complicate the narrative of seamless command. The human consequences of that complexity are tangible. Lower-level officers awaiting orders faced interrupted schedules. Supply officers balanced inventories against shifting priorities. Civilian officials managing lodgings and transport received fragmentary guidance. The burden moved down the chain in uneven ways. For those tasked with execution, the clearest guidance mattered most. Vague language and last-minute revisions create stress and error. The people living with the plans had to interpret intent in real time. Their choices shaped outcomes on the ground, often in ways not visible in the official record. In the rooms themselves, interpersonal dynamics shaped which voices carried. Some attendees had formal rank and steady papers. Others spoke with soft authority, supported by data or external pressure. The choreography of deference and insistence influenced document language. How a sentence was phrased could shift responsibility. Later, the careful wording of orders thus became a way to allocate risk. That allocation had human cost. The men and women at the bottom of lists carried the consequences. They followed instructions that sometimes reflected compromise rather than crystalline certainty. Over time, a pattern emerges in the archive. Documents show cycles of firm assertion followed by cautious revision. The pattern suggests an adaptive bureaucracy grappling with unknown variables. It also suggests a political landscape in which competing priorities shaped what was possible. Understanding these dynamics requires reading between formal lines. The presence of marginal notes and altered numbers offers footholds for that reading. They serve as indicators of a working process rather than a closed system. These clues push us to consider the limits of control asserted in public dispatches. They invite questions about who chose what to present and why. As the chapter closes, the rooms fade into corridors lined with filing cabinets and damp plaster. The motif of the file stamp recurs as the scene moves outward. The next phase of the story lives in those conduits of information. It lives in the telegrams, the courier bags, and the coded phrases sent down long supply lines. It is in the ways that messages stretched from interior tables to distant posts. The transition from measured silence to transmission will expose further tensions between containment and disclosure. Chapter 3: Veil of Secrecy. In transmission, communication moved like a hidden river through wartime corridors and rail yards. Clerks in plain coats handled telegrams with practiced, careful hands. A folded memorandum might cross 3 desks before a decision was confirmed. Men and women in uniform lapels exchanged coded phrases and curt sign-offs. The official account framed secrecy as necessary to protect operations from enemy eyes. The archive suggests secrecy may also have shaped what was recorded and preserved. Messages were layered, routed, and often summarized for different levels. Each summary trimmed nuance and compressed uncertainty into firmer language. The act of transmission thus became a form of translation rather than simple passage. In many cases, telegram headers carry inconsistent dates that complicate timelines. Those inconsistencies can shift how subsequent orders are read and executed. File stamps sometimes do not align with distribution lists, adding another layer of ambiguity. These mismatches are small on paper but practical in effect. A delayed timestamp could reroute supplies or postpone movement. A misaligned distribution list might leave a unit without timely guidance. Couriers bridged distances with leather satchels and folded memoranda tucked inside. They moved through fogged platforms and under ash-smeared lamps. Platforms filled, with men in plain coats waiting for departures that might change without notice. The choreography of movement relied on the steady arrival of accurate messages. When messages faltered, choreography became improvisation. Improvisation worked often, but it introduced variance into coordinated plans. The language used in transmitted summaries was deliberately compact. Editors sought to remove ambiguity and present certainty. That compression sometimes erased hedges present in original notes. A cautious marginal comment could vanish when a summary was filed. The loss of that hedge mattered for those responding down the line. Commanders and clerks who received terse orders had to infer intent. Their inferences shaped execution in visible ways. The veneer of secrecy could thus obscure the processes it intended to protect. Secrecy preserved advantage, but secrecy also narrowed transparency. Narrowing transparency made accountability more difficult to trace later. Historians encountering compressed dispatches find fewer markers of internal debate. The result is a public record that often appears more decisive than its drafts. Drafts reveal a different texture: crossing outs, margin annotations, second thoughts. The presence of those marks suggests deliberation that was lost in summary. Deliberation tends to be slow and equivocal. Summaries prefer speed and assertiveness. That tension between deliberation and summary influences how orders were perceived. Perception then affected willingness to comply with risky operations. For many carrying out plans, perceived clarity mattered more than actual intent. Messengers sometimes appended shorthand notes to clarify ambiguous phrasing. Those notes rarely traveled farther than the immediate recipient. They remained marginalia in a world that preferred formal dispatches. The chain of custody for messages passed through multiple administrative hands. Each hand stamped the paper, filed a copy, and archived another. The repetition of the file stamp offered an appearance of control. It also multiplied opportunities for discrepancy. A single document might show 3 stamps with subtly different dates. Those differences could reflect handling delays, or they could indicate retrospective amendments. Either interpretation changes how historians reconstruct a timeline. The veil over transmission therefore operates at the level of paper as well as language. Physical movement through stations and offices shaped what information reached whom and when. Weather, transport delays, and clerical bottlenecks all played roles. Those factors are mundane but consequential in practice. In several preserved telegram sets, the text evolves across versions. Initial phrasing uses cautious verbs and conditional clauses. Later versions replace these verbs with more declarative language. The transformation may reflect increasing confidence. It may also show a concerted effort to present decisiveness externally. Either way, the shift matters for downstream interpretation. Recipients of later, firmer language acted with different assumptions. That divergence between earlier hedged drafts and later firm messages is a recurrent pattern. It suggests that the form of transmission sometimes altered the substance of decisions. The human workers within the system navigated these shifts through improvisation and judgment. A supply clerk evaluating a terse order might divert resources based on habit. A junior officer might assume broader latitude when instructions read ambiguously. Those small judgments accumulated into operational outcomes. The veil of secrecy thus had practical consequences at local levels. Beyond localities, secrecy shaped public narratives. Press summaries depended on filtered dispatches and official releases. Editors received curated statements, often framed with confident headlines. The compression of internal uncertainty into public-facing statements smoothed the story for mass consumption. It also reduced the presence of contingency in public memory. The result is a historical record where public boldness sometimes sits above private equivocation. The motif of the folded memorandum and the file stamp recurs across this chapter. They anchor scenes of handoffs, edits, and retiming. Train platforms and postal rooms form the backdrop to a flow of small acts that determined larger patterns. Those acts are human and routine. They are not heroic in themselves. Their cumulative effect, however, shapes the arc of large operations. Reading transmission records closely reveals where preparation met chance. It also shows where coordination strained under divergent expectations. The strain produced practical problems during execution and compressed explanations afterward. The gaps between what was known at various levels and what was reported publicly matter for accountability. They also matter for memory. When public stories emphasize unambiguous resolve, private papers sometimes preserve doubt. That preservation invites re-examination rather than simple revision. In the end, the veil of secrecy is neither purely protective nor purely deceptive. It is an operational choice that carries political and human consequences. Those consequences appear in marginal marks, in misaligned stamps, and in terse summaries that traveled across stations and offices. The next chapter turns outward to how those transmitted narratives were shaped further for public ears. It will examine headlines, editorial marks, and the daily rituals that turned dispatches into collective belief. Chapter 4. Narratives. Shaped for public ears. Newspaper rows and public squares in monochrome frames show how wartime narratives reached ordinary people. Wide photos capture crowds clustered in front of printed broadsheets. Close-up shots show hands turning pages, and mid-shots show newsrooms with stacked copy beside typewriters. The recurring motif of the file stamp and folded memorandum links these scenes to earlier interiors and transmission rooms. Official statements were framed to reassure and to unify. Press releases aimed to present clarity and decisive progress. Yet the editorial process seems to have done more than simply translate facts. Copies of draft pages sometimes carry editorial marks that diverge from the final printed versions. Identical headlines reappear across different outlets with only slight variation, a repetition that may indicate coordinated messaging rather than mere coincidence. Such patterns suggest that information circulated through a small number of curated channels before it reached readers. Editors accepted submitted copy under pressure and often prioritized economy and morale. Editors balanced the reader's need for instruction and the state's desire for coherence. The language of headlines tended toward affirmation. Short declarative phrases replaced conditional constructions found in internal memos. That shift from hedge to headline matters for how the public understood risk and timing. When uncertain phrasing vanished, perceived certainty rose. Readers in civilian coats and uniform lapels confronted headlines that made complex plans appear straightforward. For many, printed lines offered comfort and direction amid disruption. The ritual of reading the paper each morning was a communal act that reinforced shared belief. Yet this reinforcement could mask dissenting voices and local anxieties. In some towns, black and white street scenes show shopkeepers watching trains with worry rather than hope. Mothers folded letters into their pockets and read leaflets with furrowed brows. Those private actions often diverged from the public mood. Press offices worked under constraint. They processed dispatches that had been compressed during transmission. Telegrams and summaries arrived stripped of qualifiers. Editors then selected which details to emphasize or omit. The selection process was not neutral. It reflected institutional priorities, editorial judgment, and external persuasion. Censors and liaison officers sometimes suggested phrasing that aligned with broader policy aims. That influence could be subtle. A single word change in a headline might transform a cautious assessment into a rallying statement. Over time, the WWII aggregation of such changes shaped national memory. The repetition of certain phrases across newspapers produced a chorus effect. Readers encountered the same construction in different towns and different contexts. The chorus created what many experienced as a unified narrative. Unified narratives simplify choice. They can mobilize resources quickly. They can also compress debate and obscure uncertainty. The compression has consequences for accountability later. When official claims are presented as consensus, it becomes harder to trace who argued for alternatives. Archival comparisons show differences between initial press drafts and final print editions. Those editorial marks often carry notes that reframe facts more optimistically. The marks may indicate editorial caution. They may also indicate external pressure to conform. Either way, they document the movement from internal nuance to public certainty. The human effect of that movement appears in portraits of individuals responding to headlines. Veterans and recruits read the same lines with different expectations. Local administrators who had seen contradictory memos sometimes felt blindsided by public announcements. When fronts changed or schedules shifted, those administrators bore the practical burden. They had to reconcile printed certainty with messy, local reality. That reconciliation often meant improvising resources and adjusting expectations. For ordinary families, newspaper narratives offered explanations that sometimes simplified complex hardships. Broadsheets declared that plans were proceeding, which could soothe immediate fears. Still, the smoothing effect sometimes deferred difficult conversations about loss and displacement. The ritual of public consumption shapes memory in long ways. Official narratives feed schoolbooks, memorials, and later histories. Where editorial compression removed ambiguity, later accounts often lack markers of dissent. Those missing markers include marginal annotations and the occasional file stamp that contradicts a declared date. Such anomalies may seem technical. They can, however, alter how future readers reconstruct timing and intent. The relationship between press and policy created incentives for both clarity and control. Governments sought to maintain morale and to coordinate civilian effort. Editors sought readable copy and steady circulation. These objectives overlapped, and they sometimes conflicted. Where conflict occurred, public narratives tended to favor cohesion over complexity. The tension between cohesion and complexity is visible in the archive of press clippings and official memos. Side-by-side comparison reveals omissions that soften debate. It also reveals how small editorial choices accumulate into broad impressions. The motif of the folded memorandum reappears in newsroom shots, linking the document's origin to its public afterlife. That visual link reminds us that public words often begin as internal notes. When those notes are edited, compressed, and stamped, their meaning changes. The change matters for how people interpret directives issued from above. It also matters for how communities remember sacrifice and strategy. Where public narratives emphasize decisive action, private papers sometimes preserve doubt and contingency. That discrepancy invites re-examination of widely held accounts. The process by which public stories are shaped therefore has policy implications. If authoritative releases omit caveats, then policymakers face fewer visible constraints. The absence of visible constraint can accelerate decisions. It can also obscure the trade-offs that inform them. Those trade-offs affect resource allocation and post-operation responsibilities. They influence which communities receive support and which must manage recovery on their own. The interplay between press and public mood then extends into the realm of human cost. People who read confident headlines may volunteer or relocate with a sense of urgency. Those who read hedged internal notes might have acted differently. The divergence altered patterns of displacement and demand. It also left uneven traces in municipal records and personal correspondence. Over time, the public narrative becomes a scaffold for national memory. The scaffold supports celebrations and commemorations. It may also obscure the granular negotiations that preceded action. Finding those negotiations requires reading beyond headline certainty. It requires attention to margin notes and to the subtle disparities in stamping and dating. Those disparities form the indicators that historians use to question simple stories. They do not invalidate large-scale achievements. They do, however, complicate the moral and political accounting that follows. The chapter closes on images of dockside crowds and newsroom staff exchanging notes. The recurring file stamp links these scenes to earlier rooms and to transmission hubs. The focus now shifts to consequences lived after operations. The next chapter will trace how strategic narratives and public messaging shaped the human aftermath, and how memory adapted to fill gaps left by compressed accounts. Chapter 5: Human Costs Beneath Strategic Triumph. In monochrome portraits and train platform scenes, the aftermath unfolded in slow, human measures. Families packed belongings into plain suitcases and boarded trains without certainty. Men, in uniform lapels, returned to stations with folded memoranda in their hands. Official accounts often framed outcomes as decisive and corrective for broader aims. Private papers and municipal records sometimes suggest a different balance of burden and benefit. Casualty lists were compiled and circulated with bureaucratic routine and quiet care. In some files, stamped dates do not align across distributed copies, indicating revisions or later corrections. That inconsistency can change how timelines are reconstructed by later readers. Reference numbers on certain folders were altered after initial filing, a change that appears in several series. Those altered numbers serve as subtle markers of administrative revision and shifting priorities. Communities hosting troops adapted daily routines to unfamiliar schedules and demands. Lodging houses converted parlors into dormitory space for strangers. Local markets extended hours to meet sudden surges of demand. Those adaptations eased immediate strain but created new dependencies in peacetime. Men and women who carried orders in their hands experienced the aftereffects in practical ways. Supply clerks balanced inventories against uncertain delivery dates. Postal workers sorted bundles that sometimes carried contradictory instructions. The folded memorandum appears repeatedly when reading these traces. It is a small object that links decision to consequence. Its creases bear the weight of amendments and endorsements. Children learned to count departures by watching train platforms empty at dawn. Mothers tucked letters into inner coats and waited for news that might not arrive quickly. The rhythm of waiting became part of everyday life for many households. Public messaging framed final operations as necessary and effective. Public messaging also shaped expectations for rapid recovery and orderly resettlement. When recovery did not follow public assurance, disappointment spread into civic records. Local officials who had seen internal hedges often found themselves reconciling optimistic dispatches with sparse resources. They faced requests for shelter and transport that exceeded planning estimates. Those mismatches affected where assistance flowed first. Some districts received priority due to proximity or visibility. Others absorbed burdens with little public notice. The distribution of aid and attention thus mirrored earlier choices about where to advertise success. Streets that had once shown headlines about triumphant landings later hosted queues for basic supplies. Portraits of solemn faces in plain coats show endurance rather than celebration. Private letters preserved different tones than public statements. They often used conditional verbs and cautious phrasing that later press reports removed. The compression of language in public records reduced the visible presence of contingency. That compression made moral accounting harder for later generations. When historians compare press editions with archival drafts, they find editorial marks. Those marks sometimes redirect emphasis or excise qualifiers. The act of excision matters. For memory, as much as for immediate morale. Municipal ledgers record costs and allocations that do not always align with national proclamations. Expenses for billeting, transport, and temporary hospitals appear in columns with altered reference numbers. Such administrative adjustments may reflect practical bookkeeping. They may also reflect efforts to reconcile public rhetoric with limited funds. Either interpretation points to human effects. Veterans returned to towns where housing had been repurposed for military needs. Some families found their homes occupied for months. Reclaiming domestic space required negotiation with local authorities and often with men who had been billeted there. Those negotiations were sometimes polite and sometimes strained. The strains show up in municipal complaint logs and in marginal annotations within housing records. Annotated notes sometimes ask for clarification about entitlement or compensation. The notes indicate unresolved responsibility rather than neat resolution. Schoolrooms adapted as well. Classrooms doubled as temporary clinics or distribution centers. Teachers kept attendance rolls that later show gaps and re-entries. Those gaps reflect displacement and interruption in children's schooling. The long-term educational effects appear in municipal correspondence over years. Economic patterns shifted as labor needs changed. Local industries retooled, and agricultural routines were adjusted to feed larger populations. Those shifts produced new opportunities for some residents. They also imposed hardship on others who lost stable livelihoods. Pensions and relief schemes were introduced in certain places. The rollout of benefits varied by region and by administrative bandwidth. Where bureaucracies processed claims quickly, families recovered sooner. Where clerks faced contradictory memos and altered file stamps, claims lagged behind. Delayed support compounded private losses. Medical records are often redacted and careful in tone. They preserve human stories without graphic detail. Many records describe long convalescence and slow rehabilitation. Rehabilitation often occurred far from the headlines that declared victory. The physical and psychological tolls accumulated in conversations recorded in private letters and in quiet entries in parish books. Those entries use hedged language indicating uncertainty and ongoing need. The human costs were dispersed unevenly across demographics. Older community members sometimes bore burdens differently than younger ones. Women who managed households during male absences shouldered increased economic responsibilities. Their unpaid labor appears in account ledgers and in repeated notes in council minutes. Those repeated notes recommend relief or suggest measures that might reduce strain. The measures were sometimes implemented and sometimes deferred. Deferred action left residual grievances that persisted into civic memory. The motif of the file stamp returns in these pages as officials tried to document assistance. Stamps appear alongside penciled calculations and brief marginal comments. Where stamps and notes align, record trails tend to be clearer. Where they do not align, reconstruction becomes more difficult. That difficulty shapes how later communities remember who received aid and why. Memorials and commemorations later emphasized broad strategic success. They rarely carried the granular record of shifting reference numbers or mismatched stamp dates. The absence of such details in public memory does not erase their presence in archives. Instead, it creates a layered narrative. One layer celebrates a turning point. The other layer preserves the messy negotiations that followed. Both layers are part of the human record. The ways communities adapted their rituals of mourning and celebration reflect these layers. Some towns built monuments quickly, using funds allocated in the immediate aftermath. Others debated commemoration over years, weighing the costs and the tone of remembrance. Those debates are captured in minutes that sometimes carry marginal annotations suggesting alternative wording. The alternatives often argue for more inclusive language or for attention to civilian losses. How those debates were resolved shaped collective memory and future policy. Where inclusion prevailed, memorials tended to note broader civilian sacrifice. Where expediency prevailed, commemorations emphasized military achievement. Each choice influenced how resources and responsibilities were allocated later. The pattern of decision and consequence echoes earlier administrative choices about message and transmission. Local archives show the echoes in repeated file stamps and in folders with altered reference numbers. These archival traces suggest continuity between planning choices and human aftermath. They do not diminish large-scale achievements. They do complicate simple stories of unanimous success. As communities moved from immediate emergency to long-term recovery, the study of documents reveals further tensions. Questions remain about how best to apportion responsibility and recognition. Those questions are still debated by descendants and by local officials. The archival evidence offers indicators rather than definitive answers. It suggests that strategic triumph carried uneven costs. It suggests that the burden of recovery often fell to those least visible in public narratives. The next segment will synthesize these legacies and ask how memory and policy continue to shape contemporary understanding and obligations. Black and white images of the 1940s leave a careful, measured impression. File stamps and folded memoranda recur across archives and personal papers. Official accounts emphasized decisive action and coherent strategy in public statements. Private drafts, marginal annotations, and altered reference numbers complicate that narrative. Those archival traces may suggest negotiation, delay, or administrative adjustment beneath certainty. The human consequences are more visible in train, platform scenes, and household records. Communities adjusted daily routines to accommodate troops and shifting logistical demands. Some local officials carried the burden of reconciling optimistic dispatches with scarce resources. Editorial marks in press drafts often removed hedges that existed in internal notes. This compression of nuance shaped public expectations and, later, historical memory. Marginal annotations and inconsistent dates function as small but telling indicators. They do not overturn achievements, but they complicate tidy accounts of command. Understanding these layers requires patience with documents, routines, and everyday gestures. It also requires attention to how messages changed during transmission. Secrecy preserved operational advantage while also narrowing public visibility and accountability. That narrowing affected resource allocation and post-operation responsibilities in tangible ways. Many consequences unfolded slowly in municipal, ledgers, and personal correspondence. Those records often carry file stamps and penciled notes that resist easy interpretation. Questions remain about who decided what and why certain uncertainties were concealed. Future study should weigh moral accounting, policy responsibility, and lived experience together. Which documents still lie unexamined, and which voices remain absent from archives? These questions point forward without resolving history's open edges or assigning final blame.